Welcome to PacWest Magazine, the radio show, the show about our exciting Pacific West Conference. The PacWest is made up of NCAA Division II universities from Arizona and Utah to California and Hawaii. It's the most beautiful and diverse athletic conference in the entire NCAA. This is Commissioner Bob Hogue, inviting you to join our outstanding coaches, student athletes, and administrators as we talk about the great excitement in the PacWest. Now here's Assistant Commissioner Tom DiCamillo, live from our studios in Santan, Arizona.
Good afternoon from Santan Valley, Arizona. Tom DiCamillo live in the KQCK studios on PacWest Radio. And it's an exciting day in the neighborhood, as we like to say. PacWest Radio on all summer. Although we will be off next week, it's the 4th of July. We are live in the studios, and Jane Textera will be joining us today. She's the Assistant Commissioner for Compliance with the PacWest. We always like to get her on a couple times a year, talk about what's new in compliance, what's changed for those out there with potential student athletes. And it doesn't matter if they're coming to the PacWest or going somewhere else. It's great information. We know we have listeners throughout the country and also in Costa Rica. Joe Carrero, our vaunted leader, is still in Costa Rica having a great time. He's setting up stations and doing a lot of different things down there, and PacWest Radio is live throughout Costa Rica. And we big hello to Joe. Jojo, his son, has taken over as he's done the last few weeks for the show. And then we'll be off next week, and then Joe will be back in the studio in 2 weeks. And joining us now from, I believe she's in Southern California, or are you in Tucson, Jane?
I'm in Southern California.
Jane Textera, the Assistant Commissioner for Compliance. Jane, we appreciate you joining us on PacWest Radio. I know we'd like to have you in the studio when you're in the area, being a native of Tucson. Jane, let's talk a little bit about compliance and what are, we have a lot of listeners around the country, and we have a lot of people that have children that may become student athletes and want to play college ball. They may not even be going to the PacWest. They could be going at all different levels. But just to start out, for those that are listening for the first time, give us kind of sort of an overall view of what your job is and what compliance is in terms of the NCAA.
Well, the easiest way to say what I do is that I deal with the NCAA rules and interpreting them and trying to protect institutions and student athletes when it comes to potential violations with these rules. There are tons of rules at all three levels. There's no way to possibly know every single rule in the book, but that's what my job is to do, is to try to know as much as possible so I can help coaches and student athletes and their parents do what they need to do to successfully navigate the collegiate athletic lifestyle.
Give us, and this may seem like an obvious answer, but it probably really isn't. Why is there a need for NCAA rules?
Well, the NCAA was created back in the early 1900s by the president at that time to talk about football safety. There had been a couple of deaths on the football field, so the NCAA was actually created to discuss making football safer, and this kind of fold into an institution that's about protecting athletes' health and welfare, safety, along with providing a fair and equitable opportunity for athletics amongst NCAA member institutions. It is a volunteer organization, so it's not an organization that every institution has to belong to. It does have its benefits for belonging to such an association, but it was to make it a fair and equitable playing field so student athletes weren't being taken advantage of, and also so institutions weren't doing things out of line that we've seen in the past.
Jane, I know you're on a cell phone, and maybe we can get you to a spot where you can, I know you're breaking up a little bit, but in terms of Division II, can you explain to the listeners the differences between, because you were at the Division I level, been at the Division II level on different occasions. What are the differences between 1, 2, and 3? Does one rule affect everybody, or are the rules specific for division?
The rules are actually specific per division. Each division has has their own president's council that deals particularly with their issues. And so what applies at D1 may not apply at D2 or D3. The other major differences between the divisions is Division 3 philosophy. They do not believe in athletic scholarships. They do believe in financial aid, in that athletics is part of their daily operation and balance of being a collegiate student at their institution. At D2, the philosophy is life in the balance, and they do provide athletic scholarships, maybe not to the extent of the Division 1, which can provide a lot more based on their revenue stream. Division 1, again, does have full athletic scholarships, and most are funded pretty well. So they have a higher revenue stream. You see a lot of them based on their football and basketball prowess. So those are big-time institutions that you hear a lot about.
So in a sport of like men's basketball at the Division I level, how many scholarships do they give out? And like in Division II, it's a little bit less.
Well, for Division I, there are what is called a head count sport. So for every basketball player at Division I, whether you receive $1 for a book scholarship or $25,000 based on your tuition fees, room, board, and books, or whatever a full ride would be, that student athlete counts as one scholarship, no matter what that amount is. And I believe they're allowed up to 12 in basketball Division I. I could be wrong. But at Division II, we're allowed for men's and women's basketball up to 10, and those are split by the amount or percentage that you're given to a student athlete. So if a student athlete receives 50% of a scholarship, it only counts as 50% of that, or half of that total of 10.
So on for example, a football team that I think at Division II, the number might be like 36 scholarships, but you have far more players. You might have 70-some players. You could split those up and give almost half scholarships to 72 players on a football team.
Correct. You could do that.
So let's focus on Division II. You've been with the Pac West a couple of years. What are some of the biggest changes that you're seeing coming up for student athletes, especially if they want to play in the Pac West, be a Division II athlete? What are some of the things that will impact student athletes moving forward?
Well, the NCAA has three concepts that are going to come up to vote in January of 2014. Dealing with initial eligibility would be the first concept, and that would be changing. Currently, there's certain standards that are set in stone that a student coming into a Division II institution, in order to be eligible their first year to compete, would have to meet. Those are pretty set in stone. What Concept 1 would do would make that a little bit different and give some flexibility. Concept 2 would deal with continuing eligibility. So for students who are already on campus, what benchmarks they need to meet to continue to be eligible. And Concept 3 would be those student athletes who are thinking about transferring into a Division II institution, dealing with maybe coming from a junior college or community college to Division II, or from another Division II institution. So those are three concepts that are changing or being presented for change at the 2014 convention that will be voted on by each member institution and each member conference. And right now, those are the biggest issues on tap.
How does that whole process work where change comes before the membership and is voted upon? Is it a school, a conference sponsors it? Does somebody have an idea? Do they identify they are seeing an issue and they have a better way of doing it? How does all that work, that those concepts come forward even to be considered to change?
That's a great question. The concepts come through two very mainstream pathways. The first pathway is identified by the NCAA and their staff, and then it is put forward to whatever particular committee. For instance, in the three concepts I'm talking about, that came out of Academic Reform Committee. So the Academic Reform Committee would listen. The Academic Reform Committee is made up of member institution personnel, presidents, SWAs, senior women's administrators, student compliance individuals, athletic directors, faculty athletic representatives. And they listen to the NCAA and what the trends are and what particular rule that they're speaking of, and if there's any need to reform it, tweak it, things of that nature. Or it could come through an institution or conference-sponsored proposal where an institution thinks of a rule or something they would like to see implemented or changed. They would put it forward based on its intent, its rationale, on what is called the NCAA system. The NCAA system, then it would be up to the sponsoring institution to garner support. You need a certain amount of institutions to co-sponsor that piece of legislation. Once that sponsorship number has been hit, it gets put forward through the system to be voted on in January by all member institutions. And the same thing would move forward with that NCAA committee track. It's put forward and sponsored by the NCAA committees. It then moves forward to the president or management council. And once it's put forward there and move forward to the next process, it would go in front of the member institutions for vote in January of 2014.
And if it passes, when is that typically implemented? Is it the following start of the academic year, like July 1 or August 1, or can it be implemented any time?
It depends on the intent and rationale behind a particular proposal. Most proposals are, when they are passed, is August 1st of that next year. So if it passes, let's say in January 2013, it would become effective in August 1st, 2013. However, there are times where particular proposals cannot move forward effectively without giving enough notice. So there are times, for instance, if there's a concept change in academics, they may wait for it to become effective for 2 or 3 more years to give more notice to those particular groups that are affected.
Is there anything that can become effective immediately? Have you ever seen that, where they see something and say, this is definitely wrong, we need to correct this, and the membership votes in January, and then all of a sudden it gets implemented? Has that ever happened?
Sure. It happened this past year when the Affordable Health Care Act was passed and upheld by the Supreme Court last fall. The NCAA immediately went into emergency session with their President's Council, and they actually removed a bylaw, made it no longer effective immediately, to allow for institutions to have more flexibility in what they could and could not do based on the Affordable Health Care Act. So that actually did just happen in January 2013.
That's interesting that there's items that from the federal government, like the Affordable Health Care Act, that have a direct impact on institutions and student athletes. And what people, I guess, don't really realize is that the process that the NCAA has is really, in a lot of ways, mimics the process that the federal government goes through.
Yeah, in a lot of ways it does. A lot of committee work, a lot of handshaking and trying to get individuals to get on board with the concepts that you are passionate about, and trying to do what's best for the country as a whole to make it a fair and level playing field, and maybe not necessarily if it's picking up on a particular item that affects 1 or 2 institutions.
Originally, or years ago, in the Division 1, 2, and 3, that concept of splitting those schools out, that happened, I believe, back in the early 70s? I think that's when that happened.
Correct.
And that was around the time when Title IX really kicked in, around that same time. Yes. So there were a lot of changes. But correct me if I'm wrong, Jane, for a lot of years, there were rules that were made, but they kind of blanketed the entire membership. Like a rule might have been made targeting Division 1 because of an issue, but then it impacted 2 and 3 when there really was an issue. Wasn't that how it used to be?
You know, it has happened in the past, and oftentimes you'll hear people in the NCAA and people who have been around a while say, oh, that was before we were federated, before the rules were actually split into division-specific rules. And some of those rules are carried over. Actually, we have one in the Pac West that's carried over about the ability to play in Alaska and Hawaii and Puerto Rico at a particular time in the school year that other member institutions may or may not be able to play. So that rule has actually carried over, and it's the same rule in Division I and Division II also.
It's let's talk a little bit about the life and the balance of Division II and something that changed. And I want to say it happened maybe 5 years ago. It could have been longer, but I think it's within the last 5 years. There's a dead period around the holidays, around the Christmas holidays and Hanukkah, that teams, the schools can't play. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Sure. That's called the winter break. It was a proposal put forward by institutions to actually give their staff, and particularly the student athletes, time to have with their families and not feel like they are overwhelmed and overworked, overpracticed, so to speak, during that time period. Yes, it's a 7-day period, and this year it runs from December 23rd through the 29th, or 6-day period, where an institution cannot compete, practice, require student athletes to be on campus, or do any activity during that time that allows their coaches to go home, or coaches to spend time with their family, their administrators to spend time with their families, and the student athletes to spend time with their families. So that particular 6-day period allows for a break during that time period that is most effective for the country as a whole at Division II. This winter break concept is far different than that at Division I, where during that time you usually see more competition because the students are not in school during that time.
During that, you used to see in a Division II a lot of tournaments, basketball tournaments, during that week, and they were spread out. Sometimes they'd be the day after Christmas. They'd go up until the day like Christmas Eve or the day before Christmas Eve. And what people don't realize is that, there might be those holidays, Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, where they're not playing, but then the student athletes are traveling on those days, or
Correct.
They're away from home, and there's a cost component to that too.
Correct, and that was something that was really thought about with this winter break. Is if you're leaving for a tournament on the 26th, you would potentially leave on Christmas, or potentially leave on Christmas Eve. And is that the best thing to be doing with the cost of flights and hotels during the holidays and food and all of that necessary stuff that comes along with traveling? So to provide a life and a balance where we want to value our student athletes' well-being and our administrators' well-being, it was important for that piece of legislation to pass.
One of the things about the NCAA and this whole process, and it's an interesting process. I was fortunate to be in it a couple times where the voting. You talk about how that actually works. You go in a room, and there might be 1,000 people in there, or 800 people in there, and people have a chance to go up and almost talk or filibuster, and other ones have an opportunity to, talk for it, talk against it, and then the vote is called, and you have these electronic devices, and you vote.
Correct. And each institution and each conference only gets one vote. So only one person who's designated from that institution gets to vote as part of the delegation. Once that vote is recorded, that actually instantaneously shows you the results. The interesting thing about electronic voting, which actually happened this past year, is a particular proposal was passed, and there was a lot of rumblings about this particular proposal. This particular proposal back up for reconsideration. An institution who had voted in proponent for the actual passage of the piece of legislation calls for it to be reconsidered because it was so close. I believe it was 49 point something to 49 point something. So it was truly split. And so it barely passed. It may have been 48 something to 49 something. But regardless, it was called for reconsideration. And during this reconsideration, institutions and conferences got up and either a proponent for or against that particular piece of legislation. When the reconsideration happened and the vote was called again for this, it failed. And at that point, it became a dead issue, and the institution, or at this particular point, it was NCAA, have to go back to the drawing board to see if they could get it passed through the same channels in 2014.
It's interesting because I also have noticed that during some of those is that people will vote, look at the ones, and then you'll have people leaving to catch flights or try to get out of there, and that changes the dynamic when you come up for that reconsideration.
For sure, and that happened again with this particular issue. Is a lot of people left, and those that left, I believe it's been few and far between. They've had reconsideration votes, and those that left, their vote can no longer be counted on that reconsideration. So you lose the total, and in some instances, those people who were against the particular proposal were able to gain votes in that particular area because they were a stronger collective group than those that were for it.
Let's talk a little bit too about that process. Is that, and it's been something that really over the last few years, especially, that the student athletes have a voice, and they tend to carry a lot of weight when they get up and speak on an issue.
Correct. That's a great point. The NCAA had instituted quite a few years back what's called the National Student Athlete Advisory Committee, which is made up of student athletes from around the country, or leaders of their institutions and their conferences, where they get together and talk about how particular proposals affect them and from their point of view. And once they come up with either a vote for or against that particular piece of legislation, they have an opportunity on the floor during voting to voice that opinion. That is their opinion speaking for the collective student-athlete body at Division II across the country as a whole. And they do a great job. We had Sarah Bowden last year from Grand University do a great job for us at the 2013 convention, and I'm sure we'll have Christina Ferrer from Hawaii Pacific University do a great job for us this coming year, able to advocate for or advocate against whatever particular piece of legislation that's coming up. But yes, administrators will listen to student athletes to affect them directly.
We're visiting with Jane Textera from the Pacific West Conference. She's the Assistant Commissioner for Compliance with the Pac West. Been with the conference for a couple of years now. And, you know, Jane, you were a student athlete at Texas. You played softball there, and now you work in the college athletic arena. What are some of the things that you've seen, and maybe it's more culturally or maybe it's just philosophy in general, from the time you were a student athlete to now your role as a compliance person? What are some of the things that you've seen philosophically maybe that has changed over the last 10 years?
Well, that's a great question. I feel that not necessarily that the philosophy of the NCAA has changed. I think the manner in which rules are administered has changed. That the voice of the student athlete speaks stronger than ever now. That student athletes are empowered, where I don't believe they thought they were empowered when I played. Not that we weren't empowered. I don't think we thought we were empowered. I believe that there are more opportunities out there to be seen on television. That's been a huge impact. If you look at, for instance, the Women's College World Series for softball, when I played, only the championship game was on television, where now every single game of the Women's College World Series is actually televised. And that does wonders for a sport. It brings it to people who may never have seen it or don't watch it until that particular point in time. So I think those are probably some big issues that have happened over the last 10 to 15 years, is that the access to information, whether it be through Twitter or social media, Facebook, that those interactions bring in more people as fans, more people from alumni to be able to follow their team and just be a part of the athletic culture that their community or their particular institution holds.
In general, the NCAA, and I always thought this was somewhat unfair, that the NCAA sometimes unfairly characterized as basically the god of all athletics. In other words, they're judge, jury, and executioner of everything, and it's the people in the building in Indianapolis. And what people don't really realize is that the committees, the voters, the ones that that design the rules or suggest the rule changes, those are all the institutions. It's not really coming from a group of individuals that say we're in charge. It really comes from the membership.
And that's correct. It's a volunteer organization, and that volunteer organization looks to its members, whether that be the institutions and the people who work for those institutions, to govern themselves. So oftentimes you hear, especially at Division I athletics, you hear, well, the NCAA enforcement staff didn't do a very good job, or this punishment by the NCAA wasn't enough, or it was too much, whatever it may be. Well, what people don't realize oftentimes is those particular individuals or groups are made up of member institution personnel. So they're truly governing themselves. I happen to sit on a committee at a national level, and I actually get to be involved with cases and seeing what's happening at other institutions and how that affects their ability to do what they're trying to do as their mission within the NCAA framework. So yes, that's correct, Tom, that it is actually governed by the member institutions, and that some of these quote-unquote penalties come from member institutions themselves.
It's you hear that exactly what you said. The NCAA did this, the NCAA did that, and you could really go through and say, well, here's a list of schools on that committee that made that suggestion to go forward that was accepted by the membership. And it's really, you could list all the schools that were involved with it and say those were the individuals. So I always thought that was sort of a mischaracterization of how the NCAA is portrayed at times. The biggest thing is for student athletes, if you could give advice out to parents that have high school kids that are considering playing collegiate athletics, and they're seniors, you're coming up to their senior, junior, or sophomore year. What are some of the big things that the parents, and we have about a minute left, that the parents need to know moving forward? Clearinghouse, eligibility, all that kind of stuff. What advice could you give them?
Well, to start, I would agree with you that the eligibility center, getting your academic and amateurism certification as early as possible, is critical for your ability to actually play and compete at an NCAA member institution. I think the other thing I would give advice on to people who are looking at colleges is to think about the value of the diploma they will get when their time is done. Only 1% of student athletes are professional athletes in whatever sport. That is a very small number. So you're going to have to get a degree. Does that degree carry value once you leave that institution? The other thing I would have people consider was remember they're committing to play for an institution, not a particular coach. So granted, that coaching staff member is vitally important. They're going to be a part of your son or daughter's lives for the next 4 years, but they do move on. So will you want to still be at that institution if that coach moves on and you're not able to transfer, or if you decide to transfer, will you want to go? So those would probably be the three biggest points I would bring forward to prospective student athletes, and as my nephew gets ready to get into this improvement thing with basketball, I think that's important to consider. I think the other thing, and let me make this last point now, get off of this particular soapbox, is point 4 is I would not worry about signing so early and committing so early. A lot of parents seem to, and students want to keep up with the Joneses and be a part of, I signed as a sophomore. Well, that's great, and I do know that's where you want to go. I'm all for it. But remember that the institution is not committed to you to do anything until you actually sign a national letter of intent during your senior year. Again, you sign that piece of paper to receive a scholarship and be a part of the national letter of intent program. The commitment to the institution is not.
Well, Jane, we appreciate you joining us today, and we know that next time you're in the Tucson area, we'd love to have you back in the studio. Joe has his corgis around, and I know they always love to see you. So Jane Textera, Assistant Commissioner for the Pacific West Conference, overseeing compliance. Jane, thanks for joining us.
All right, thanks for having me. Have a great day.
You too. again, I'd like to thank Jane for joining us. Next week is the 4th of July. We'll be off next week. We'll on the 4th of July. And in 2 weeks, we'll start the new season of Pac West Radio as we gear up for the fall. We'll have a lot going on moving forward. A lot of the schedules will be posted on our website as we build those for the fall, gearing up. And we'll also talk about a lot of the academic awards during the month of July around the Pac West. So it's Pac West 24/7, 365. And we always enjoy talking to the fans throughout the United States, throughout the world on Pac West Radio and our growing fan base in Costa Rica. So for Joe Carrero and for JoJo, I'm Tom DiCamillo, and thanks for listening to Pac West Radio on KQCK in the Santan Valley.
Hi, this is Daniel, your host for Rock and Roll 101, every other Sunday at 5 on KQCK.